There is a particular kind of financial story that almost never makes the news, and yet it plays out in neighborhoods, office buildings, and dinner conversations more consistently than most people realize. It is the story of the person who earns well, genuinely well by any reasonable measure, and yet arrives at their late 40s or early 50s with surprisingly little to show for it in terms of actual accumulated wealth. Not because they were irresponsible in any dramatic sense, not because of a single catastrophic decision, but because of a slow and largely invisible process that eroded the distance between what they earned and what they kept, year after year, in ways that felt entirely reasonable at the time.
This is not a story about failure. It is a story about a system, a set of psychological, social, and structural forces that operate quietly in the background of financial life and that tend to expand spending in near-perfect proportion to income growth, leaving net worth surprisingly flat even as salaries climb. Economists have studied this pattern for decades. Behavioral researchers have documented it across income brackets and geographies, and yet it remains one of the least understood dynamics in personal finance, largely because it is camouflaged by the appearance of success. To understand how this works, it helps to start with a number. According to data from the Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances, the median net worth of American households in the top income quintile, meaning households earning roughly $130,000 or more per year, is significantly lower than most people would intuitively guess given those income levels. When you account for outstanding mortgage balances, auto loans, student debt carried into higher-earning years, and relatively modest investment portfolios, the picture that emerges is one where income and wealth have become structurally decoupled in ways that a previous generation would have found surprising. High income, it turns out, does not automatically produce high net worth, and the gap between those two things is where this entire story lives. The psychological mechanism at the center of this gap has a name that most people have heard, but relatively few have examined closely: lifestyle inflation. The terms sound simple, almost self-explanatory, but the actual behavioral process it describes is considerably more sophisticated than the phrase implies. Lifestyle inflation does not typically happen through reckless or impulsive decisions. It happens through a continuous series of individually rational-seeming upgrades: a larger home purchased because the family grew and the income justified it, a newer vehicle because reliability matters and the monthly payment was manageable, private schooling because the local options felt inadequate and the cost per month seemed absorbable, vacations that grew more elaborate because the stress of high-earning careers felt like it deserved proportional relief. Each decision, evaluated on its own terms, appears defensible. Evaluated in aggregate over a decade or two, they form a pattern that quietly prevents wealth accumulation, regardless of how much income flows in. What makes this pattern so persistent is that it is not just psychological, it is social. There is an entire ecosystem of signals, expectations, and peer comparisons that surrounds income growth and that exerts constant pressure on spending behavior. When someone moves into a higher-earning professional environment, they are simultaneously moving into a reference group whose consumption norms are calibrated to that income level. The houses in the neighborhoods those peers live in, the schools their children attend, the restaurants they frequent, the cars they drive, all of these become the invisible baseline against which one's own choices are unconsciously measured. Psychologists refer to this as relative deprivation, the phenomenon where people feel poorer not in absolute terms, but in relation to those immediately around them, and it is one of the most powerful and least discussed forces shaping financial behavior among high earners.
The math that underlies this dynamic is straightforward once you lay it out clearly. Consider two individuals who both begin their careers at age 25, both earning $60,000 per year. The first individual receives consistent income growth over the following 2 decades, reaching $180,000 per year by age 45, a genuinely strong trajectory by any measure. The second individual earns a more modest path, reaching $90,000 per year by the same age. If the first individual allows their spending to expand in proportion to their income, which the data suggests is the most common behavioral pattern, and the second individual maintains a relatively stable savings rate throughout, the net worth comparison at age 45 can look counterintuitive to the point of being almost disorienting. The higher earner, despite taking home dramatically more money over that 20-year period, may have accumulated less investable wealth than their lower-earning counterpart, simply because the gap between income and spending remained narrow throughout.
This is not a theoretical scenario constructed to make a rhetorical point. It reflects a pattern visible in longitudinal financial data across multiple studies and across multiple countries, and it illuminates something important about the relationship between income and wealth that most financial conversation tends to obscure. Income is a flow, wealth is a stock. The conversion of one into the other requires a sustained and deliberate gap between what comes in and what goes out, and that gap is precisely what lifestyle inflation is designed, not intentionally, but structurally, to prevent.
There is also a compounding dimension to this problem that deserves careful attention, because it is where the long-term consequences become most significant. Every dollar that flows toward an upgraded lifestyle rather than toward invested assets is not simply a dollar that fails to accumulate. It is a dollar that fails to generate returns and whose absence compounds over time in exactly the same way that its presence would have. A $1,000 monthly difference in investment contributions between two individuals, sustained over 20 years at a historically average market return, does not produce a $240,000 difference in wealth. It produces a difference that is substantially larger because the invested dollars are continuously generating returns on returns, while the spent dollars are generating nothing, or in many cases, generating ongoing costs in the form of maintenance, insurance, and depreciation. The true cost of lifestyle inflation is not the spending itself, it is the compounding that the spending prevents.
What is perhaps most interesting about this dynamic from a behavioral standpoint is how difficult it is to perceive from the inside. High earners who are caught in this pattern rarely feel like they are making poor financial decisions. They feel like they are living appropriately for their income level, making reasonable choices and planning for the future, because they're contributing to retirement accounts, because they own property, because their children are in good schools. The wealth illusion is convincing precisely because it is constructed from individually sensible-seeming decisions that collectively produce an outcome that is much weaker than the underlying income would suggest was possible. The historical parallels here are instructive. During the post-war expansion of the American middle class through the 1950s and 1960s, rising incomes across broad segments of the population produced genuine and widespread wealth accumulation, in part because the consumer infrastructure designed to absorb that income, the credit systems, the subscription services, the lifestyle signaling mechanisms, had not yet fully matured. As those mechanisms developed and deepened over the following decades, the relationship between income growth and wealth accumulation became progressively less automatic, more effortful, and more dependent on deliberate behavioral choices that run against the grain of the social and commercial environment. The high earner of today operates in a fundamentally different landscape than the high earner of 60 years ago, and the tools required to navigate it successfully are primarily psychological rather than mathematical. Understanding this dynamic does not require pessimism about income growth or ambivalence about professional success. It requires clarity, a precise understanding of what income actually is, what it can and cannot do on its own, and what the specific behavioral conditions are under which it converts into lasting financial stability.
Income without a deliberate and protected savings rate is, in the long run, a sophisticated form of running in place. The pace increases, the effort increases, the lifestyle expands, but the distance covered in terms of net worth remains surprisingly short. Recognizing this pattern is not the end of the analysis. It is the beginning of a more honest and more useful conversation about what financial progress actually looks like and what it actually requires.